Welcome to the Good Company podcast, where good company meets. Hello, welcome to the Good Company podcast. My name is Peter Mulholland, and today I interview Professor Barry Spurr. Barry is a former professor of English and poetry and is the author of many scholarly works. Today, Barry speaks with me about his new book, Language in the Liturgy. I first asked Barry to explain the main theme and purpose of his book. I hope you enjoyed today's Good Company podcast. Barry, thanks for joining us.
Good morning, Pete. My book has just come out this January of 2025. I spent the last couple of years writing it, but it's based on a whole lifetime, really, of experience of liturgy and liturgical language. And it came about, the actual project, because the earlier book that I wrote on this subject, The Word in the Desert, which was published in 1995 by the same publisher, eventually sold out. And that was an account of the controversies since the Second Vatican Council, and also in the Anglican Church, since there were similar reforms after the Council in the Anglican Church in its liturgy too, through the 1970s and 80s. And there were very vigorous controversies and arguments about this, so I gave an account of both of the churches' experience of this big change in their liturgical lives. And the book was essentially an account of the 1970s and 1980s into the 1990s in relation to those liturgical movements, that big liturgical change in the Western churches at that time. So it's a dated book now, obviously, a generation on, 30 odd years on. So my publisher thought it was time for a new book, and I was wary of just doing an update of the old one. I think I needed to do something very new. And what I've always said over the last 30 years or so, and I think readers agree, that the one chapter in that earlier book was the chapter on the language of liturgy, which discussed the principles of liturgical language in general terms, without reference to this or that controversy, this or that argument that was then topical but had lost some of its topicality over the decades, subsequent decades. So this book is an expansion of that particular chapter, which was a brief chapter, and I felt that it needed much more detailed treatment. But it is also, inevitably, you've got to give examples, you've got to refer to what's happening in the present day, you're not just talking in theoretical terms. And I'm also talking from the point of view of a layman. I'm not a trained liturgist, I'm not a biblical scholar, I'm not a theologian, but as I point out in the book, one has to always remember that most of the people by far who experience the liturgy are lay people. So it's written from the perspective of a member of a congregation. And in my case, I had the good fortune, I suppose, in relation to this book, you could describe it, but also good fortune more generally, of having been brought up in a solid, old-fashioned high church parish in Canberra, where I was born, Canberra, Australia. And then studying at Oxford, I was very interested in Anglo-Catholicism, and that was the subject of my thesis there on T.S. Eliot's Anglo-Catholicism, and that's become a quite well-known book in Eliot's studies. And then in time, and as a result too, there were many of the changes, theological and liturgical, that occurred in the 70s and 80s, and at the time I was writing that book in 1995, I converted to Catholicism. And so as far as the book is concerned, these matters are much more important in one's life, of course, but as far as the book is concerned, I think this is valuable because I've experienced the liturgical lives of both churches through the last, nearly 70 years, as a matter of fact. So that's the basis of it. And therefore, I'm, of course, referring to modern controversies and the things that have changed in the debates about the liturgy in the Catholic Church and the Anglican Church in the 21st century. So it's not just an update of the earlier book. It's I hope, a very contemporary book, but also a book that takes into account a much greater consideration of what liturgical language should be, what it should be aiming to achieve. And as we may talk about a bit later, there are also chapters on music, in the liturgy, because I had a career as a church musician for many years as an organist and a chorister. And also there's a chapter which I think is rather paradoxical in such a book that's about language and words and speaking, a chapter on silence and the importance of silence in liturgy. So that's a general idea of where it came from and what it's about.
Thanks, Barry. I grew up in the 80s, so the only church liturgy that I have been used to is the Novus Ordo. However, I believe that the church liturgy wasn't always like that. And as you say, you've seen both. What are some of the changes that you noticed and that you wrote about?
Well, the principal focus of the book, which is after all called Language in the Liturgy, must be on language, and I will come to that because that's the main topic of it. But what I point out, and at a number of points in the book, which may also be of interest to people, is that I consider the major change, and in my view, the most damaging change that has occurred in both churches in their liturgical celebrations, particularly of the Mass or Eucharist, has been the movement from the ad orientem position facing east at the altar to the versus populum facing west to the people. I think this has had a very bad, totally in my view, and I argue the case in detail, negative effect on worship. But that's, though it's a major issue, and you did ask about that, I mean, my focus nevertheless is not so much on that, though I discussed in detail, it is on language. And of course, the main change, as I imagine everybody knows, even those who are churchgoers would know, in the Catholic Church has been the change from Latin to the vernacular tongues. And that, of course, occurred after the Council. It's one of the great misunderstandings of the Second Vatican Council that they proposed the vernacular in the Mass. They did not. And Pope Benedict makes it very clear not only that they did not envisage the movement of the vernacular, but that it would, if it had been put up as a proposal, Pope Benedict writes in one of his writings about liturgy, it would have been resoundingly rejected. So much that has been of damage in the Catholic Church since the Council has been since the Council and yet conducted in the name of the Council. And you're a church musician, and I'll just give one example in that world as well, which is closely related to the matters of language as well, of course, is that the Council argued for the preservation of the Gregorian chant. And what Catholic parishes are true to that, yet claim to be in the spirit of Vatican II. So, I mean, they're just two huge examples in language and in music where what is supposed to be in the spirit of the Second Vatican Council is decidedly not so. In fact, there's a contradiction of it. It did not also envisage the westward-facing celebration. And my argument, Pete, seeing you did mention what my main points might be in relation to language, for example, and the big change in language, is that not only was there a change to a vernacular tongue, because of course in the Anglican Church that change to the vernacular tongue happened in the 16th century with Thomas Cranmer. So that was not a new innovation in the Western churches, but it certainly was in the Latin Church. And the problem, and this is what I focus on in great detail, most of the book is devoted to this, is the poverty and banality of expression of the translations into English. And it's about the English. I'm not a scholar of German or French, so I'm not going to talk about how the Italians pray in Italian, or the Spanish in the Spaniards in Spanish and so on, or the Japanese in Japanese. I'm talking about the Anglophone world. Which is a large enough slice, of course, of the Christian community. And the problem, I argue, is that the language of liturgy ought to possess some of the qualities of poetry. And unfortunately, if you're going to require that, or challengingly, if you're going to require that, you're going to need people who are capable of composing language of that kind. And we have one acknowledged genius in the English language tradition of liturgical composition, of translation from Latin into English, and his name was Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, in the middle of the 16th century. And the first prayer book in his translation came out in 1549. So that's the benchmark, and it's my benchmark of classical liturgical prose in English, and I judge all of the examples, and I give many, many examples in comparison with that, and I'm afraid they are found wanting. And I think this is the problem. And I think that there are much larger issues in the society generally, not just in the Christian world, but in the secular world in the West, which the choice of language, the sorts of words that are used, the way in which that language is conveyed, the substance of the prayers and everything reflect as well. And when this whole potpourri, this whole mess of stuff has got together, if you like, you end up having a language of liturgy that is not honouring God, but referring to the world, and not lifting the spirit, but making people concentrate on the here and now, which is the opposite of what liturgy should be doing. And I think that there needs to be a reform of language in liturgy.
There is a vast difference between a hymn such as "Peace is flowing like a river" and some of the beautiful liturgical hymns such as Panis Angelicus or Beata Viscera. What are some of the hymns that you refer to in your book?
Well, I refer, one has to distinguish, and of course you know this, and those with a church music background know this well, there's a difference between chant and hymns. And I concentrate a lot on chant, and in the Anglican tradition, the version of the Gregorian chant that also came in the 1550s, in the middle of the 16th century, was the setting of the communion by John Marbeck. And that's a version very closely related to, and of course Marbeck knew the Gregorian chant. Of course, so did Cranmer. They were brought up in the Latin liturgy, and that's that beautiful, free-flowing but very simple melody of the Gregorian chant, which was it's the most ancient form of music in the Western world, I think, as the musical historians tell us. So it's an age-old form of music and beautifully appreciated by many people, often in the concert hall or on CDs, or listening to monastic choirs chanting it and what have you. And yet you'd be hard put to find a parish that even knows what Gregorian chant is, or Marbeck in the Anglican world, the equivalent of it, just setting it to the vernacular of Cranmer. And so that's gone. I talk at length about its qualities, its musical qualities, and its memorability, and what is also forgotten, how easy it is. I do have a parish priest friend who's taught some primary school children, young children, 8 or 9 years old, some of the simpler chants of the Gregorian chant, and they learnt it very easily. Well, why wouldn't they? I mean, it's very simple, and it's memorable, and it's moving, and it's rhythmical. So that's important. And then, of course, there are the great mass settings, as you know, by the greatest composers, Mozart and the rest and what have you, which if you've got a competent choir, and organist, can be performed, and in the best places they are regularly in cathedrals and those few parish churches with excellent musical tradition. But there again, in so many places, again, in both of the churches, though I argue that the Catholic Church is, if anything, and there are all sorts of reasons for this, worse off in its modern musical customs than the Anglican Church, which does have a great tradition to draw on, even though it's ignored by many in Anglican churches today. You have these modern mass settings. And I've been looking at one recently by somebody who sent it to me for commentary, and the banality of the music matches the banality of the words. I mean, it's all right. I've been saying how the Gregorian chant has a simplicity about it, but it's a noble simplicity. Yes. And this plodding and kindergarten-like musical scoring of banal language, I mean, is it any wonder that the composers are not interested in composing for the church when the texts that they're given are so poor? And so that's, and then of course there's the great tradition of hymnody, and which is a wonderful tradition in both churches, but more acknowledged in the forgetting of it in the Catholic Church than in the Anglicans. The Anglicans still are pretty good with belting out some of the great hymns from the past and what have you. But so many, and you quoted from one of the line from one of them a few minutes ago, so many of these modern hymns are, to quote the memorable word of an archbishop who said this to me once, trash. You know, when we're worshipping God, we should be, the word worship means this, we should be offering what is most worthy. And this is not the most worthy. It is worlds away from what is most worthy. And I actually argue, I suppose controversially, but at my age, I don't care if I'm controversial. I argue that unless you're going to have excellent music in church, you should have none at all. And so much that is offered is terrible.
Precisely.
So that's, I don't know if I've strayed from your original question, but yes, I mean, the wonderful hymns need to be revived. There are all sorts of associations that are trying to do this, I think, and good luck to them, but you've got to have a willingness from the clergy and the people, and you've got to have trained musicians to bring these things off, to put it in that vernacular phrase. And without that, it can't happen. And there's this whole problem, this is a Catholic problem, this whole problem which has been well addressed by that famous book, which was a bestseller, Why Catholics Can't Sing. And I recount some amusing, well, they're sort of teeth grinding, but also amusing situations that I've been in, because I was once a bit of a singer till my voice became so croaky through years of lecturing. And I found myself in a large congregation, once the organist has played the hymn tune through, being the only one who's singing. Even though the hymn tune was relatively easy and the text was in front of you on the leaflet that was handed out when you came in, and then you hear all these people saying that one of the great fruits of the council in liturgy was participation. Well, I look around and see people with their mouths resolutely shut. And the trouble then for the few of us who do want to sing, we're a little bit nervous about giving a solo performance, and so you stop singing too. And the hapless or poor organist, and I've been in this situation myself, has to plug on playing the organ. I think one of the great mistakes, but I'm getting into a byway here, so I must stop soon on this matter, but I talk about this at some length, is the innovation of the cantor. Put at the front of the church often to lead the singing. Yes. Well-intentioned, very well-intentioned, but the problem is it's yet another discouragement from everybody else singing. And I was at a requiem mass, a funeral mass not long ago, where 3 hymns were scheduled, which is probably too many, but nevertheless in a non-singing culture, but 3 were scheduled. And by the time we got to the 3rd one, everyone had just given up singing, and they were seated too. And as you know, as a musician and as a singer yourself, everybody, I was taught this in my early days of singing, you can't sing well sitting down. You know, for all sorts of diaphragm reasons and what have you, should be standing up, breathing properly. They're sitting down, and by the end of it, well, everybody, including myself, I'm afraid, because I wasn't going to do a solo or a duet with the cantor, was sitting there in silence while the cantor sang the hymn. So that was an idea that was meant to assist and encourage actual but active participation, that overused phrase and that often misunderstood phrase in liturgy, in the post-council conciliar documents, and actually has had the opposite effect. It's assisted in the silencing of people. So that's a huge problem for church musicians, and I have a chapter on music in the liturgy, which I hope will be of assistance to people who are trying to improve that situation in both the churches. But good luck to them, I say.
Oh yes, oh yes. I recall going to a mass at St Mary's Cathedral in Sydney, and they had a soprano singing one of the hymns and the offertory, and her voice was too high for anybody to participate in. So there's a lack of basic musicology, basic musical awareness.
Yes, yes. I mean, that's just a lack of musical common sense, isn't it? And I was looking at this mass that this friend sent me that he's composed for his parish, and if I can just go into musical notation for a moment here, it's all very banal, I'm afraid, the scoring of the very banal text, and it's all just above middle C. So if it's in the key of D, for example, most of the notation is D, E, F sharp, then back down to D. And he's trying there, this is the opposite of what you're talking about with the soprano, but it's also wrong. He's trying there to pitch it so there's a chance that people might sing, because the natural human voice for a woman is contralto, the natural human voice for a man is baritone, as we know. But as I said to him in my commentary, I haven't had a response from him, which I suppose is unsurprising. I said, this is just going to sound like a growl. And this is even for things like the Sanctus. He has just a roundabout middle C there, or C sharp if it's in the key of D. And I mean, that's a grumbling kind of a sound from men and even from women too. You need a little bit higher than that. So getting these things right surely is not that difficult. But even this is a musician has got it wrong. Apart from the fact that it's a plodding tune, as much as he's able to extend it over 3 or 4 notes, and the text is banal too. And you have this great treasury of church music. We'll use it. And a big point, Pete, is, just while I think of this, otherwise I'll forget it because we've been glancing at it, is this issue of participation.
Yes.
And again, if I can come back to Pope Benedict, who was a marvellous commentator on the liturgy, and others have said this too, that this literal-minded idea that participation means you've got to be doing something. You're participating when you're listening to the readings. You're participating when you're listening to the sermon. You're participating when you're taking Holy Communion. You're not saying anything then, apart from Amen. And this idea that everybody has, unless they're doing something and vocalizing something, they're not active and they're not participating, is a terribly literal-minded and, well, basically stupid idea. You can be participating by praying quietly and privately in the course of the Mass as well, the course of the liturgy. And it's not a surprise that the most popular and the only growing liturgy in the Anglican Church in England is cathedral choral evensong, where you don't, as a congregant, apart from singing the occasional hymn, do anything except listen and pray. Listen to the choir singing the setting of the Magnificat and the Nunc Dimittis. Listen to the readings from the King James Version of the Bible. Listen to the prayers from the Book of Common Prayer, and listen to a beautiful anthem sung by the choir. Is that not participation? Participation perhaps at the most profound level. So this is another thing, another concept that needs to be really seriously scrutinized. And I give it a few pages, that this crude idea that participation means that everybody should be up and doing something in the liturgy. And the more people that are and the more activity there is, the more successful the liturgy is. I would say it's the reverse.
I noticed at Notre Dame Monastery in Tasmania, which is a traditional Latin Mass community that follows the 1962 rite, what impressed me was the real sense of immersion in something greater than myself. The chants that the monks were very well practiced in were in Latin. They were entirely scriptural. The melody really served the words. And we, all of us, which, by the way, consisted of quite a number of young families, we sat there in silent reverence. And that was just beautiful. That was, as one of the participants said to me down there, that what young people, and these people were people under the age of 30, what young people need is truth and somewhere to stand. And the church hasn't given them anywhere to stand. The church has given them feelings, and which has come through in the words in the hymns.
Well, also too, Pete, I hope I'm not interrupting you, while I think of this too, and I argue this at great length in the book, and this comes to the matter of silence as well in the liturgy, is that young people, but I think people generally in this crazy world that we live in, want and yearn for, and this is why the traditional rite is doing comparatively so well, and why that choral evensong example is 700 people queuing to go into Westminster Abbey for choral evensong and what have you. People want a place that takes them away from the world, a place that gives them the opportunity for silence and for peace and for proper and deep recollection. And also, God is to be worshipped. And we worship him in a way that is appropriate to that transcendental and numinous idea of the eternal. And all that is happening, or so much that is happening in modern liturgy, is counterproductive to that. And it doesn't have to be in Latin, but it does need to be a music that is worthy of worship and in a language that is worthy of worship. And that's why the places that are flourishing in the seminaries and in the parishes, in the communities, are places that are acknowledging that truth. And they are attracting, interestingly, both many young people and families, as you say, and the evidence is there. It's not just an impression, the evidence is there. And interestingly, too, a large proportion of the congregations are men. And this is one of the issues I focus on, which will no doubt cause a great deal of anger and everything. But again, I really couldn't care less, because I think it's an important issue, and that is the feminization and the infantilization of liturgy.
Oh, yes.
Treating adults as if they're little children and concentrating, as take up an idea you mentioned earlier, on feelings and feeling good and your emotions. Well, these things are important, but they're not ultimately important, and they should be balanced with some hard teaching and some emphasis that takes you out of yourself. And also with in relation to this sort of communal contemplation of the navel, which the westward-facing celebration nurtures, and such as intercessions for a parish, often composed by a layperson or delivered by a layperson, also tend to nurture this inward-turning approach to the liturgy, when it should be outward-turning and, most importantly, upward-focusing. And that's what the eastward position does, the ad orientem position. And as one of the people that I quote in my book quite often, Dr. Hammond from Cambridge, argues, this east-westward facing position not only has a bad effect on the congregation, but it has a bad effect on the clergy, because the clergy, instead of looking up to God, are looking into the faces of their congregants. I mean, if you're facing people, it's rude not to look them in the eye. And as much as clergy might want to sort of look above the congregation, they'd probably be regarded by the congregants then as rude and discourteous. And we shouldn't be focusing on the priest. The priest is the servant of the altar, and watching his expressions and his actions and what have you can be a distraction rather than a nurturing process for prayer. So I think it's a very big mistake. And of course, in many places, the situation's been turned around, including many traditional Anglican parishes, the Old Anglican High Mass, which is celebrated at a number of famous places around the world, at All Saints Margaret Street, which I refer to in London, for example. That's ad orientem. And the difference is a profound one, a psychological one as well as a liturgical one.
I still recall a priest mentioning to me, a Catholic priest, it was quite traditional, but also offered the Novus Ordo and would offer the Latin Mass, was that there is a real difference when he offers the Mass ad orientem, because it's good for the priest, because he can focus on Christ. And the whole congregation are focusing on Christ. I know that for me and for many people who came back to the church after a long time, one of the attractions was the fact that it was focusing on something outside of myself.
Yeah.
And it wasn't the traditional singing, the hymns that were about God rather than my feelings, because to be honest, the whole society around us trains us to just think about ourselves and our feelings. And I think that may have been what you were mentioning with the feminization. And when I was young, I recall deciding that I wasn't going to go to church anymore. I was about my teenagers back in the 80s, because I had the sense that they were trying to entertain me. And I thought, well, I could be doing a lot more things on a Sunday morning. And interestingly enough, that's what Father Ripperger, who's a podcaster in America, a priest, says, that if the church is saying to young people, well, come along and be entertained, what the young people are going to say is, well, they're just going to go stay home and play video games.
Yes, well, one of the young women who went to the World Youth Day, where you had some guitar gyrating priests, for example, at the Mass, the most recent one, she was interviewed on, I saw the interview on one of the channels on YouTube. And she said, if young people want to go to a nightclub and listen to that sort of music, they will. But when they come to church, they're looking for something else. And the other thing, which you would know very well as a musician, of course, is the entertainment that is provided in terms of music when they try to ape the pop variety. Even I can tell from my very advanced years, it's pop light. I mean, that's the problem. It's not even good pop music. It's rotten pop music. So, and the young people, of course, can see that, and they can see it's a fraud. It's not what they want in any case. If they want to go to a nightclub and dance, they will. They don't want to come to church for that purpose. So that is a huge mistake. But one of the things too, and this is a major issue, Pete, and we've touched on this a few times, and it's at the basis of this in many ways, is one of the criticisms of the sorts of things and the sort of positions that you and I would take about the need for beauty of music, beauty of language, the numinous, the transcendental, and what have you in worship, and the beauty of ceremonial too, and all of the rest of it, and the decoration of the church and the layout and all of the rest of it. The big argument against that is, oh, this is just a desire for beauty. This is just an aesthetic obsession. All you're looking for is an aesthetic experience in church. Well, one of the problems of that argument is that aesthetic may be a term of abuse, though I don't see why it should be. But of course, what it also means is beauty. Well, since when is it objectionable to want to have something beautiful to offer to God? And to be drawn into a knowledge of God and of the divine through beauty is something that has happened throughout the Christian centuries, I would have thought, in poetry, in music, in architecture, in vesture, and it should be in liturgy. Yet so much that is offered is a case of, to use a term from Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, an uglification rather than a beautification of the liturgy. So this argument that to be requiring beauty and to be judging things on aesthetic principles is bankrupt is itself a bankrupt argument. And I focus in great detail on the poetic qualities of Cranmerian language. He translated from the Latin, of course, and so much of his translation is it has a Latinate vocabulary, a polysyllabic vocabulary, and he uses all kinds of rhythmical devices, which I go through in great detail, to make his prayers beautiful to the ear and appealing to the soul. And there's been attempts, and the Vox Clara Committee in Rome, chaired by our late Cardinal Pell, was devoted to improving the English translation that occurred in the 1970s, as you may well know. Vox Clara meaning speaking with a clear voice, which I also think clarity is another one of the great mistakes. We can come onto this perhaps in time, this idea that the liturgy must be clear and comprehensible and everything. Is God clear and comprehensible immediately so? I don't think so. One spends a lifetime coming to know him, I would have thought. And one of the problems that Cardinal Pell's very well-intentioned committee confronted was the need to elevate the language. But the problem that has happened in the course of this, and this has been identified by a number of commentators, not just by me, is that they've inserted some more complicated words like consubstantiation or whatever they might be. I've just forgotten some of them now, and co-eternal words like that, Latinate words. But the trouble is these are in the company of more banal language. There's not a consistency. So again, this is an aesthetic judgment, but it's an important one, because instead of the words elevating you, they strike you because of their oddity. They're sort of a pearl amidst some very ordinary groundwork. So that's and what the root of the problem there, I don't want to be unkind to that committee because it had the best intentions, is that they were all theologians.
Oh.
There wasn't a wordsmith, a poet there, and I mean, would you be able to find such a poet today? Would you be able to find a Cranmer today? Probably not. So this is the problem they keep coming up against all of the time, that the focus on getting everything right theologically doctrinally is very important, and in terms of the liturgy expressing what it needs to express and doing so correctly, that's all very important. But that's only the beginning. You need to have a language that will speak to the people, and what is more, be so enduring in its speaking to the people that it will last through the centuries. I mean, what sounded modern in 1970 won't sound modern in 2070.
Oh, yes.
So does this mean that the liturgy has to be constantly rewritten to bring it up to date? And then you have the problem, which I think even perhaps modernists might acknowledge, even if they don't want to talk about things that they think that they've got wrong, is that you can go from parish to parish to parish and encounter such different styles of worship that you've got no idea that you're belonging to a communion.
Oh, yes.
And I mean, as everyone knows, in the case of a Latin Mass, you could go to Mass wherever it was in the world and the Mass would be the same. And in the Anglican Church, it was the same too, that the Book of Common Prayer in its various forms, in high church places, low church places, it didn't matter. It was still the same language. The ceremonies might have been different and more elaborate in some and pared down in others. The music too may have had some differences, but the basic language of the prayers was immediately familiar. And so you had this sense of belonging to the body of Christ.
When I was down at Notre Dame Monastery in Coldbrook, I recall thinking that there is something beautiful, there's something healing and appealing about the fact that I'm chanting the same psalms and often using the same melodies as people centuries ago. So I felt connected. And I really think that's loss of tradition is really just sad.
Well, it's a communion with the living and the dead.
Oh.
And that's a very important point. And this is opening up to one of the big issues which I focus on, but don't have to go into great detail about, because so many people have been going on about this in the last 30 or 40 years. And this is this whole post-1960s, 1970s countercultural dismantling of the Western world and the Western culture. And it's a tragedy that the church has participated in this. I mean, the disposal of the ancient liturgies is just a chapter in this unraveling, willful unraveling of the Western Judeo-Christian culture. And when the church should be presenting a bulwark against that, it's offering nothing more than a kind of parallel movement to it. And then it's surprised, and this is a major issue which I bring up at the very beginning, and again, this is just obvious, there's no argument about this, then it's surprised that the pews are emptying. I mean, the whole reform, I lived through the 70s, of course, the 60s and 70s, the period of the reform. The whole argument was we need to do this to bring people back to the churches. This will revive the churches, and it will bring people back into the churches as they were starting to fade away in the 1960s and the big upheavals of the, revolution of that time, the social revolution of that time. Well, it's been a complete failure. And the church, those who defend the modern liturgies and the post-Vatican II church and all that's happened in Anglicanism similarly in the 70s and 80s and subsequently, they need to explain why this has been such a failure when it was touted to be would be such a success. And my argument is that the ruining of the liturgy is one of the major reasons for that.
Oh, yes, exactly. Do you sometimes think that the generation that came up with the changes in Vatican II, I've often wondered if many of them, the bishops and cardinals and after the post-Vatican II, I'm wondering if any of them actually had a real sense of the transcendent to begin with. I wonder if...
Well, who is to know? I mean, the great anthem of the 1960s was captured in the title of a pop song one heard far too often in that decade, "The Times They Are A-Changing." And the verb that was repeated over and over again was that you needed to change. Everything needed to be changed. What was never considered was that change could be for the worse. Change was good. We must change everything. It's ruined the universities, of course, as we can now see. The seeds were sown then, and we're now reaping the whirlwind of all of these things, and in the social and secular world at large. And the churches felt that they had to go along with it. So whether the people who were the great advocates of this ever had what you say, that those beliefs in the first place, well, who is to know? Only God knows that. But one thing's for sure, they were hell-bent, and I use that phrase deliberately, on deconstructing the tradition. And that was in tune with the spirit of the times. And I mean, the phrase, aggiornamento, I'm not quite sure of the translation of it, but I think it meant bringing in a new spirit or bringing in a new life, opening the windows and everything to the church. Well, what came in was the world.
The word progress, people talk about progress, but the problem is there's also something called progressive cancer, progressive tooth decay.
Yes, terminal. Indeed, that's right.
I can guarantee that the numbers of people, I was young in the 80s, the people of my generation are very few who kept going to church. Very few.
Well, I mean, people would argue that this is not the church's fault per se, that the culture was rabidly anti-Christian and secular, and of course the education system is now totally of that kind in the schools and the universities. So, you know, the churches had no one should deny this, had a formidable battle to confront this and to turn it around. I mean, it's very easy to sit back and say they should have done all of this. It's very, very hard, but they've just made the fundamental mistake, which is understandable. They thought, I mean, I lived through all of this. They you know, the young people won't like this. You know, you can't have, you know, a long sung service or something. The young won't like this. You know, we need to have folk music and stuff like that. That'll get the young in, and let's have some liturgical dance and what have you, and bring in the drum kits and the bongo drums and all the rest. That'll get the young in. Well, it's failed. I mean, it wasn't so clear when I wrote that earlier book in 1995. It was pretty clear. I don't want to sound like a prophet before my time. I knew in the 1960s this would all be a disaster. I may say so. I'm telling the truth, I did, and it has been. And you know, so what have you got? What are you going to do in the future? My book is subtitled Past, Present, Future. So it's not just moaning about what has happened, and nor is it just idealizing the past. There are things in the past that were not good too. But what needs to be done in the future is for some serious discussion and debate about the liturgy, and to really go back to the grassroots of an understanding of what liturgy is for. And it's for the worship of God, because God is to be worshipped. That's the fundamental idea of liturgy. It's not a group therapy situation. It's not an entertainment for young, old, or middle-aged, or whatever. It's not a social justice meeting affirming all of the current politically correct ideas about anything you care to name. It is the worship of the eternal Father.
Yes.
And the language of the liturgy, the music of the liturgy, the disposition of the liturgy must be focused on that ultimately. And to the degree that it isn't, it will fail in its purpose. And people will think, well, what's the point of it? As you've said earlier, what's the point of coming? I might as well stay at home and we'll go to a nightclub where these things will be done properly.
Yes, by people who can play them. Folk music and rock music.
Yes. I think a number of people have pointed this out too, that the times are changing, maybe, dare I say it, for the better, that the people who were the great advocates of all of this were my age and or older, and they're either dead or, you know, at the 11th hour of their lives. So a new generation is coming through, and I think that can give us some hope. And something that the church needs to focus on, but it needs to look at itself too, and to move beyond these bad elements.
Yes, and just about beauty, I recall, I think it was C.S. Lewis writing about the thing with beauty is that there's an assumption that there is something outside of us that draws us to that beauty. And I think that's very...
Yes, yes, he does say that. And he says in relation to that, he compares it to being in love. And he says that when this experience is experienced, I'm never less myself, but never more myself. Well, I'm in that state, paradoxically.
Yeah.
It's in losing myself, I find myself more deeply. And you know, to be coming along and just concentrating on yourself or on the community. And of course, the kiss of peace, that innovation in the liturgy, is just another expression of this idea of, you know, this group identity and the communal contemplation of the navel. It's just it's aliturgical, it's unliturgical. And of course, there should be ample time for fellowship. And there should be ample time for teaching about the liturgy. And that's something I want to come on to now too, if I may just change the direction for a moment. It's this issue of clarity and comprehensibility, this fallacious idea that has grown up in the liturgical culture of the post-conciliar era in both churches, that the liturgy should be clear and comprehensible in its language. I mean, in everything else too, but I'm focusing on language here. Well, this is a furphy too. This is a delusion too. I mean, the things that really matter, and the poetry is an example of this. Poetry it's the most difficult of the literary arts. We all know that. It's very hard for those of us who spend our lives teaching it to students to get them to be interested in it and to break through it. But it takes time, and it takes intelligence, and it does take a degree of feelings and emotion to all of those things together to understand and interpret the profundity of what is being said. So if you're under the conviction that everything you write liturgically has got to be immediately clear and comprehensible, well, then you strip the mystery of faith away, which is at the heart of faith, in the pursuit of this literal-minded idea of what must be clear and comprehensible. And that leads to this other phenomenon, which I referred to in that chapter I mentioned earlier, and that's infantilization. And so much of what is happening in liturgies, particularly this appalling aspect, which I talk about, I call it a kind of paraliturgy, where the clergy feel they need to explain what they're doing as the liturgy unfolds. Oh, now I'm going to sense the coffin. Oh, now I'm going to do this, that. I mean, just do it. And if people don't understand it, let them come again until they grow in understanding of what it is. But this idea that the liturgy is some kind of kindergarten, in which the uninformed and the stupid need to be given instructions about what is happening, is another very bad development, and we see it all over the place. And it shows a lack of faith in what the liturgy should be and what the liturgy should be doing. And that's the idea that it is an adult thing and the serious thing. Now, as Susan Sontag, a philosopher I don't agree with on most things, but nevertheless she got this right, she said to defend seriousness in the modern Western world is an adversarial act. And so this is another aspect that's come into liturgy, but it's a sort of a happy gathering, and you know, the applause comes in. As Pope Benedict says, the moment there is applause in liturgy, you know the liturgical sense has died. I mean, it's all that it should be an entertainment. Well, you used the correct word much earlier, that it should be an entertainment. And that if it's not entertaining, then it won't be interesting and people won't pay attention and they won't come. I mean, this kind of neurotic response to how liturgy needs to be, and how I've got to get this person out of the pew to do something and that person out of the pew to do something, and that will show that we're all being actively involved and everything. Fellowship is great. Not in the liturgy, that happens afterwards. Liturgy symbolizes that fellowship, but it doesn't need to express it at every turn.
Exactly.
There's so many things that are wrong, and but so many things that could be made right. And my book is not just a critical one in that sense. It is very critical because there's much to be criticized. But it's also a book that proposes ways in which things can be improved if people will only look hard at what's happened, realize it's been a failure, and face up to the need to do a U-turn, as it were, a U-turn including in the sanctuary from the westward-facing position to the ad orientem.
Yes. Just going back to what you were saying about how they add words onto to try and maintain some traditional, as if you can.
Oh, right. Yes. Oh, no, oh, yes. That I'm see. Yes, I'm understand. Yes, I know what you mean. Yes, that's right. Yes, yes, adding words on to the trying to embroider the basic fabric with this sort of momentary elevation. Yes, that doesn't work. But if I can just, in talking about adding words on, Peter, another important issue is this idea, and this speaks to the inadequacy of the liturgy, where the clergy feel they've got to say a few more words in a prayer. The prayer is there, written out in whatever kind of form it might be, and they feel they need to inject some further meaning into it by adding a few words to it. Well, that in itself indicates the poverty of the original text, if that has to be the case. And also, and Dr. Hammond talks much about this in her wonderful book, The Sound of the Liturgy, so I don't go on about this too much because she said it all herself. There is this matter too of how the liturgy is said, and the various ways in which clergy feel they have to add meaning by a particular way of saying the liturgy. I mean, it should be said anonymously. But no, that's not good enough because you've got to inject it with meaning because it has such a poverty of meaning itself because of the banality of the expression. So they've got to try and inject meaning. And as often as not, that only exaggerates the poverty of the expression. I mean, somebody else who I quote says just how ghastly the modern Roman Missal is in its English translation, and I disagree strongly with him on that. I don't think it's ghastly. I don't think it's terrible. The problem with it is that it's just so ordinary.
Yes.
I mean, there are some prayers, and I go into detail discussing them, that are very poor for various reasons, including a number of ungrammatical ones. That's another issue. I don't think it's terrible. The problem, in a way, it'd be better if it were. Then it'd be very obvious that it was. It's just that it's so ordinary and so banal. And that's inevitable because the English language has deteriorated since the age of Shakespeare, believe it or not. And that's what they've got to, this is the material they've got to use. And they themselves are getting everything right, as they're very keen to do, and as they should be theologically, doctrinally, and so on, lack that essential quality, which is what Cranmer had in abundance because he was a genius of the stature of Shakespeare, that is to inject the English language for liturgy with the poetic and the numinous and the transcendental, and most importantly, the memorable. Who can remember and regard it as worth remembering any of the phrases from modern liturgies? Whereas if you look at literature, just in the English-speaking world, the phrases from Cranmer's liturgy are to be found throughout the novels and the poetry of the subsequent centuries, because these were the words that became part of they were learnt by heart. And that, in other words, it's a lovely phrase, that they abided in your heart and in your memory. Well, and it's a matter of rhythm too, not only of vocabulary, of cadence. And these, I mean, so many people in the churches today are liturgically tone deaf. We speak about tone deaf people in music, don't we? Who can't hold a note and don't recognise a note. Well, I think verbally they're tone deaf. To the banality of it. If it was terrible, anybody would notice. It's not that I don't agree that it's terrible. I just think it's so ordinary, and it shouldn't be ordinary.
I hope you enjoyed today's Good Company podcast. Barry's book, Language in the Liturgy, can be obtained by following the link below.